we were saying you were saying how you found it surprising that we both deal with a single image and put it in an unusual environment.
We both work with recurring images, and as our starting point, and work. Our themes are about other things, not the objects we're dealing with. They're much more personal. In my case, I'm exploring things which are more psychological. I think states of anxiety and isolation and remoteness in social situations. And I work with bottles quite often, and materials such as wire, and wrap my bottles up and confine them in the center very often of the space. I make a small frame, paint it up with wood, and place my objects in there. I sometimes think of it in terms of butterfly collecting, a recurring insect in a case, but there's a manic quality approaches it, because the attempts I make at confining my butterflies to these boxes is very drastic. Be like using nails or tacks or something to put your butterfly on its base, where I'm using, rather than a little pin holding the insect in the case, I'm using extreme ways of confining my materials. Copper wire in one instance,
which I think brings out the psychological.
Well, it's a desperate attempt at confining something,
because the confinement material is stronger than required for the object, which brings in.
It's also a very delicate, tiny little object, and there's this overbearing attempt to hold it.
But to me, there's a sense of a very fine balance there, that they could break out to me at any moment.
Which is
the psychological. Maybe because the object is so light, there's got to be something stronger there.
There's a delicacy about the piece, and this overstating the needing to hold it in that position. It's I find it a poetic, tragic sort of statement that these attempts are being made to hold this tiny, delicate bottle, and you go about lashing them down. And if you put that into terms of, rather than why I think of it in terms of a figural element, is that I see it as very much a statement on social situations, is where we're tied into places by our social insurance numbers. You've got to go, and everywhere you go, you've got to have a OHIP number, social insurance number. People want your telephone number, your bank account number. You're required to answer to people all the time. There's all these little conditions on your existence. I find these make it ridiculous in a lot of ways to think in terms of being an artist and a sense of freedom to explore things. You go about doing your work when you're confined in a lot of ways by having, your income tax form come, and you've got to fill that out, send it in. It's all these things that stop you from being that free sort of spirit. You're continually pulled back into the confined rigidity of a society imposed on how you think, how you behave, who you answer to. Where I think your approach to your chairs is a totally different attitude.
Yes, it's still a single object, in an environment, but the color is the important part of the environment to me, because the color speaks. And when I work very intuitively, and the color becomes an emotional element. The chair is something you relate to. It's an object in everyday existence. But by means of putting in the color, it's like moving to a higher plane of existence. So I'm playing back between our reality and other existences, I think, that we feel. So the colors, in a way, represent a spiritual element. I get, we were saying, I get a lot of my images, after they've mulled around in my head and incubated, there comes a time when, often just when I'm going to sleep or waking up, I see these colors in lovely harmonies, and when I go to put them on paper, it's very different from my head, and it became a very important point in my understanding as an artist, to realize, to accept that you'll never get what's inside your head exactly, and you don't need that, because you have to deal with what's in front of you at that moment, that painting or that drawing. So, and to use that medium. So what's in my head becomes a point of departure, and to go from there, I'm sort of saying the same things, but in an intuitive way as well.
I think that in both our cases, having found the objects we feel comfortable working with gives us that freedom to explore the idea element of our work. In your case, that sense of a chair, much more than it's about color. It's also about the relationship of the colors, and very much on that emotional level, involving the viewer, getting them caught up into the...
I feel I need to express my emotion while I'm doing the work. Where I'm working from, it's important for me to, by my gesture in the paint, to show my involvement, to sort of bring the chair to a life, even though it's an inanimate object. There's a sense of, I want there to be a sense of life around it. Not to say that a chair has a life of its own, it doesn't, but it's trying to say that there are other elements of life around us than our real world. And color is a very spiritual, symbolic, and emotional thing. It's all those things at one time.
I think very much both our approaches to work are very poetic in that sense, is that we take, it's more than the objects that we're dealing with. But it's not a literal relationship at all.